We make this need our feast. Wendell Berry. Prior to 1980, the flanks of Mount St. Helens were lush with towering firs, hemlocks, and cedars, some centuries old. But in just minutes on May 18th of that year, a volcanic eruption transformed that rich, diverse ecosystem into a moonscape. 42 years later, I wandered this former forest, now a vast, sloping plain, many miles across, scarred by deep ravines and decorated with scattered volcanic rock. I was alone on what would prove to be the hottest day of the year, many miles from the nearest road, and hiking toward an isolated water source labeled on the map as Pumice Springs. I managed my water supply such that as I arrived at the small clump of vegetation marking the location of the spring, I had only a mouthful remaining. I was glad for that mouthful when I discovered that the spring had dried up. After a hectic search, I stumbled upon a sort of rock basin with damp sand in the center. I dug the sand out and watched the small hole slowly fill with murky water. It took more than an hour to extract 1 liter of water using a hand pump filter. Prudence dictated that I turn back rather than press further on to the next spring on the map, which I had no confidence bore any water at all. So, with the sun now at its peak, I set off across 8 miles of shadeless terrain, bracing myself for the exertion of descending and ascending a dozen deep, pumice-sloped ravines. The physical exhaustion fell on me more quickly than I thought it would, and with more impact, like walking in a suit of armor. The temptation to begin gulping the little water I had began. As I stood at the edge of yet another wearying descent, deeply thirsty, bone-tired, and miles left to go, I said out loud to no one, "I think I'm in trouble." 20 minutes later, the cramps began. I'd stopped sweating and would occasionally fall to the uphill side of the trail when my legs and eventually the soles of my feet cramped. I had heard of heat cramps before, but I had never experienced them. I could barely walk. I'm a 4th-generation creature of the temperate forests. In my world, water is a surplus commodity that's deflected, redirected, and protected against. On that day, I found myself in a desert, a very strange landscape indeed. But the strangest landscape was the interior one, which began to emerge. At one point, while stealing a sliver of shade in the overhang of a boulder, I sensed a voice. A child's voice. My voice. He was about 9 years old, and he said very clearly to my adult self, "Dan, you have to slow down. Exerting yourself is making it worse. Slow down. Don't breathe through your mouth. You are allowed no more than 1 sip of water and only when you stop to rest, but you must stop every 15 minutes. Your rest will last the time it takes for you to feel 5 gusts of wind on your face. Close your eyes and count each one." That sip of water, slowly taken and savored in my mouth, was like champagne. As I lifted the blue plastic bottle to my lips, I watched the water swirl around inside, liquid jewels. I thought of the journey those few ounces of water had made to arrive here in this moment. The eons, perhaps other lips it had passed, maybe a snowfall in the Himalayas, maybe a glacier in Greenland, or perhaps a monsoon rain in India. And now here it was, saving my life. Then a breath of wind, so wondrous and delightful, touched me. I could feel it carry the heat away from my burning head. Eyes closed, I smiled and made an audible sigh. That was one. 9-year-old Dan chuckled, happy that adult Dan had chosen to play this very serious game. It was so quiet between gusts, and I was so tired, and there was such peace that I almost fell asleep until a cramp seized me. I cried out into that lonely quiet, irrationally worried that someone would hear. 9-year-old Dan was perplexed by this, and he turned to ask Jesus about that. Jesus was standing right next to him. It turns out that as I floundered through this foreign landscape, afraid and in actual danger, Jesus and my childlike self were having quite the adventure. That part of me, which is arguably most deeply attached to Jesus, wasn't put off at all by a land with no water. He could use his imagination. He could wonder at it all and figure out what to do, even as adult Dan cried out in pain and fear. With Jesus by his side, little Dan is alert and ready, not because he's afraid, but because he doesn't want to miss anything. That's two, I panted as the latest cramp subsided. The sensation of a cool breeze really is remarkable. I raked my fingers through my hair as it blew, like I was washing my hair in it. My neck and face felt red and tight, and I imagined the wind as a light blue mist that soothed my angry skin. I caught myself smiling again. "Why do you think someone would hear you?" little Dan asked in a guileless tone. "There's no one for miles. Why are you worried about what people think?" I sensed Jesus had prompted him to ask me. I didn't want to talk about it. "Why?" he insisted. "This isn't the time," I said, mourning the loss of the breeze. "Answer him," Jesus said, not cruelly, not a command, but an invitation. "I don't know." "You know," I blurted out. "We get made fun of. A lot. We've got to be good, so everyone isn't mad all the time. Sometimes the only way to feel good or safe is when a grown-up says thank you or good job. The rest of the time, it's just so scary. I'm just so scared all the time." Little Dan and Jesus were looking at me so intently. It wasn't pity. They didn't cry with me, but they were right there beside me. A fresh breeze began to stir, and both of them closed their eyes and let it wash over them too. That's three. My eyes were drawn to the distant, undamaged lowlands to the east. The big trees still grew thick and strong there. Beyond them I could see Mount Adams, and further away to the south, the near symmetrical shoulders of Mount Hood stood proudly against the blue sky. Turned to the north, and a portion of Mount Rainier could be glimpsed, most of it cut off from view by the bulk of Lewitt. It's Mount St. Helens' much older name, meaning smoking mountain. 9-year-old Dan suddenly said a little too loud, "Cool! We're sitting in the middle of 4 active stratovolcanoes. Wouldn't it be awesome if all 4 went off at once?" As I laughed out loud a little, I think I heard Jesus laugh too. Because you know what? That would be cool. I imagined what it would look like, how the ground would shake, and how the roar would feel like a truck hitting you. And then my shirt began to stir. Here comes number 4. After recovering from a quick succession of cramps, this time including my thumbs, it occurred to me for the first time that being in trouble meant there was a real chance I might not see Brenda or my daughters, their husbands, my friends, or a future grandchild. Bracing for a wave of sadness or fear, I looked up toward those distant trees to the east, and little Dan and Jesus were right there, with perplexed, knowing smiles. Little Dan said, "You know you're brave, right?" "You're brave," I countered. He cocked his head in a bemused way, not wanting to say the obvious. "Is this real? I mean, are you really me?" I asked. "There's just the three of us here," he said. Jesus stood and walked to me as the fifth and strongest breeze began to stir. He crouched down in front of me and smiled with welcome and such delight. I thought he must be looking at little Dan, but he was looking at me. "Just the two of us," he said. The wind began to die down as he stood and extended his hand to pull me up. I stepped out from the shade of that rock and into the scorching sun. The air was so still, it was almost solid. The only sound were crickets clicking away as they careened through the air. I became aware of the smell of sulfur. I hadn't noticed that before. Amazing. 42 years later, and it still lingers. As I began trudging up the side of that ravine, bracing for another wave of cramps, I began to sing out over that strange, beautiful landscape. "In the shadow of your wings, I will sing your praises, O Lord." Then I thought better of it, and I simply hummed it through closed, smiling lips. We make this need our feast. Admiral Jim Stockdale said, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." This is Holy Saturday, existence in the tomb. We cannot say life in the tomb because it is, by definition, the space between life and death, the liminal, the shadow space of the exile, the gap between stones, the margin, the riparian zone where it is neither land nor sea. It is the dwelling of the exile in Babylon, where there is no temple, but Yahweh still speaks. We cannot escape it without abandoning the whole work. We cannot advance it except by wiping it out. We cannot see it directly, but only out of the corner of our eye. It is when we breathe deeply, let our shoulders drop, our hands open, that the song begins to emerge. When paradox no longer frustrates us, but instead lures us in closer with the promise of wonder. When we sense the presence of Jesus there with us in the dark of the tomb. The dark is no longer an enemy, and we remember Sunday is coming, and so we make this need our feast.